The Hunter's Curse. They found him in the middle of the forest, lying face down in the mud, his body frozen like he had seen something too terrible to describe. The forest around him was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. The towering trees cast long shadows over his lifeless form, their leaves whispering secrets in the faint breeze. The air smelled of damp earth, and something metallic, like blood. It was a scene that made the bravest among us shiver. And no one dared to step closer at first. No one wanted to touch him, not even the bravest hunters in the village. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth was twisted, like he had tried to scream but couldn't. People said it was a curse he brought on himself. My name is Adamu. I'm not a hunter or a brave man, I'm just a fisherman, and I wouldn't have been part of this story if it weren't for that day in the forest. But I saw everything. I wish I hadn't. It started during the dry season, when the rivers ran low, and food became scarce. The hunter, Okik, was known for his skill with the bow, but he was also known for his greed. He didn't hunt for his family or the village. No, he hunted for himself, selling the finest catches to the traders who passed through. Okik didn't respect the forest or its spirits. Everyone knew that. He would kill anything, even animals that were forbidden by tradition. One evening, Okik came to the village square dragging a massive antelope behind him. The animal's fur was glossy, and its horns looked like they belonged to a king of the forest. The elders whispered among themselves, their faces tight with worry. That antelope wasn't an ordinary one. It was sacred, a messenger of the forest spirits. No one was supposed to harm it. Where did you find it? An elder asked. Okik shrugged, his lips curling into a sneer. Does it matter? It's dead now. A hunter hunts, and I've hunted. The elder shook his head. You have brought trouble on yourself, Okik. That animal belongs to the spirits. Okik laughed. Let them come for me, then. I'm not afraid of old stories. The trouble began that night. Okik's wife, Gozi, said he didn't come home after taking the antelope to the traders. At first, she thought he might have stayed back to celebrate or drink with friends, but as the hours passed, worry crept into her voice. By morning, her concern had turned to panic. She went from house to house, asking if anyone had seen him. The neighbors gathered in small groups, murmuring about what might have happened. Some blamed the spirits, while others whispered about wild animals. The air in the village was thick with unease, and people began to fear that something far worse had occurred. She thought he might have stayed to drink palm wine with the others, but when the morning came, he was still missing. By midday, a group of us, mostly young men and a few elders, set out to search for him. We followed his usual hunting paths deep into the forest. The air grew heavier the further we went, like something was watching us. We glanced nervously at one another, the group silent except for the sound of snapping twigs underfoot. Someone muttered a prayer, their voice trembling. This place feels cursed, an elder whispered, gripping his walking stick tightly. Another hunter wiped sweat from his brow and whispered, I don't like this. It's too quiet. The unease spread among us like a shadow, each step feeling heavier as if the forest itself wanted us gone. We found the first sign of trouble, near a large silk cotton tree. Its roots stretched out like gnarled fingers, clawing at the earth, and the bark was marked with strange, deep scratches that no animal could have made. The air around the tree felt thick, almost suffocating, and there was a faint, sour smell that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A faint rustling sound came from the leaves above, though there was no wind to stir them. This is a warning, he said. We should go back. But the others wanted to press on, and so we did. I should have gone back. I should have listened. As we moved deeper into the forest, the birds stopped singing. The usual sounds of monkeys and insects faded away. The silence was so loud it felt like it was pressing on my ears. That's when we saw the footprints. They were huge, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. The tracks led us to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was Okik, or at least what was left of him. He was crouched on the ground, his face buried in his hands. At first, we thought he was alive. One of the younger men called out to him, but he didn't move. When we got closer, We saw why. Okek's body was stiff and cold. His skin was pale, and his eyes stared straight ahead, even though his hands covered his face. It was as if he had died in the middle of trying to block out something horrible. The ground around him was scorched, like fire had passed over it, but there was no sign of a fire anywhere else. The elder who had picked up the knife earlier knelt down and whispered a prayer. "The spirits have judged him," he said. "We must leave now. If we stay, we might share his fate." We carried Okek back to the village, though no one wanted to touch him. We used long branches to lift him onto a mat, and tied it to 2 poles. When we got back, the elders called for a meeting. They warned everyone to stay away from the forest until they could perform the proper rituals to appease the spirit. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Okek's face, frozen in terror. I thought about the footprints in the clearing and the burnt ground. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't something natural. The next day, the elders went into the forest to perform the rituals. They wore white cloths tied around their waists, and carried small gourds filled with offerings of yam, kola nuts, and palm wine. Each step they took seemed deliberate, as if they were treading on sacred ground. One elder shook a rattle made of calabash, its sharp, rhythmic sound cutting through the heavy silence. They formed a circle around the silk cotton tree, murmuring chants in low, steady voices that seemed to blend with the rustling of the leaves. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, a mix of frankincense and charcoal. As they chanted, they poured the palm wine onto the earth, and placed the kola nuts at the tree's roots, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. They took offerings of yam, kola nuts, and palm wine. When they returned, they said the spirits were angry, but had accepted the offerings. They warned us again to respect the forest and its rules. Okek was buried outside the village, far away from the rest of the graves. No one wanted his restless spirit to haunt them. But even after he was buried, strange things kept happening. Hunters reported hearing whispers in the forest, even when they were alone. Some said they saw shadows moving among the trees, shapes that didn't belong to any animal. I stopped going near the forest altogether. I'd seen enough to last me a lifetime. People in the village still talk about Okek and what happened to him. Some say it was just a wild animal, something he couldn't fight off. But I know better. I saw the way he was lying, the terror on his face. Whatever took him wasn't just an animal. They say the forest has its own justice. If you take more than you need, if you disrespect its laws, it will take something from you in return. Okek learned that the hard way, and every time I pass by the edge of the forest, I remember his twisted face and the empty silence of that clearing. Some things are better left alone. Months passed, and life in the village began to return to normal, but I still couldn't forget. One day, I overheard 2 young hunters talking about venturing deep into the forest to prove they were brave. I tried to warn them, but they laughed. "You're just a fisherman, Adamu," one of them said. "We're not afraid of stories." They went into the forest that evening. By morning, only one returned. His face was pale, and he wouldn't speak of what happened. The other hunter was never found. The elders called for more rituals, but the forest felt heavier after that, like it was alive and angry. Even now, when the wind blows through the trees, I sometimes hear whispers. I don't know if it's the spirits or my imagination, but I've learned to stay away. The forest remembers, and it doesn't forgive.
If you enjoy my story and the general feel of this content, please subscribe to this channel so that you will be among the first to be notified when we post a new content. Don't forget to like, in order to encourage us, and please make your comments on what you like about the story.